So we're back, and it's time to talk about cognitive ability tests as a potential predictor. So let me get my little animation going. Okay, so when we talk about general cognitive ability, we're talking about what you might think of as sort of regular intelligence, sort of applicable everywhere, as opposed to like specific cognitive ability tests that might tap into certain kinds of problems that people might solve or styles of thinking. When we administer general cognitive ability tests, it accounts for about 25% of the variance in the criterion performance. So in most cases, we're talking about job performance, right? So about 25% of a person's ability to perform well in the job is attributable to their general cognitive ability. Some people think, well, US intelligence tests are biased, or that they are designed only to work in the US or North America and things like that. Well, it turns out that general cognitive ability predicts performance similarly across all the different countries that have been studied, different cultures and things that have been studied. And so it seems to be a pretty good measure of, a pretty good stand-in for predicting a person's ability on the job. A really common one that's used for just general cognitive ability in the workplace setting is the Wonderlic Personnel Test. It's something that the organization usually would subscribe to, and a person would administer the test, but they don't necessarily have to be a super well-trained person. There's not like a graduate program that includes training in the Wonderlic Personnel Test. It's sort of just general test administration principles that are used for administering that. Specific intelligence will account for between about 16 to 25% of the variance in criterion performance. So we have specific cognitive tests for like mechanical ability or spatial ability or clerical ability, these kinds of things. And so if you have a job that's heavy on one of these things, like mechanical ability is one of the ones that has greater, R squared or determining the coefficient of determination. It's closer to the 25%. Clerical ability is probably closer to the 16%. But there are certain aspects that are sort of like, I almost said general, and I don't want to use the word general because it's over on the left-hand side of our screen. So I don't want to say general, but that are generalizable, I guess I should say, across a lot of different specific skills. And so there are probably some items that would tap into mechanical ability that would also tap into spatial ability. There are certain things in the spatial ability that would also tap into clerical and so on. Now, an area of intelligence that has gotten a lot of attention lately is emotional intelligence. And so just to define it, it's your ability to generate, recognize, express, understand, and evaluate your own emotions as well as others. So being able to generate appropriate emotions yourself, being able to express your own emotions, being able to recognize somebody else's emotions, being able to understand your own emotional state and other people's emotional states, and then being able to evaluate your own emotional state, being able to evaluate someone else's emotional state and understand their perspective. So people who are big proponents of emotional intelligence argue that emotional intelligence really leads to effectiveness in the workplace, and that it's actually really beneficial in relationships and in your personal life. Some of the things that have been argued about emotional intelligence, and I actually teach a class called Emotions and Emotional Intelligence, a lot of things that have been argued about emotional intelligence are a little bit more theoretical and less data-driven. There isn't a lot of evidence necessarily that higher emotional intelligence is associated with better job performance. One thing that emotional intelligence is associated with in the workplace is people with higher levels of emotional intelligence tend to get their calls for help answered more quickly than people who are lower in emotional intelligence. And so maybe people feel more empathy for them or feel more like they deserve help more than a person who's lower in emotional intelligence. All I can say is that emotional intelligence accounts for about 22% of the variance in work performance. And part of it is that depending on what you measure, you will get higher correlations between emotional intelligence and, helpful behaviors, and then also being helped behaviors. You won't see as much of a correlation between emotional intelligence and, let's say, math on the job or something like that. That's not going to be a good predictor of those things. How about some psychomotor tests? These are measures of your sensory abilities as manifested in behavioral responses. So the psycho part of that title refers to like your perception, and then the motor is your behaviors, right? So a psychomotor test might include, just a really simple one, might include something like a tone is made, and then you're supposed to respond by pushing a button as quickly as you can, right? Like that's a psychomotor test. And so in psychomotor tests, we're always going to be evaluating the speed of your motor response and your accuracy of your motor response as evidence of coordination between your sensory system and your motor or behavioral system. So here's an example of a psychomotor test. This is the Purdue pegboard test, and it's sort of a fine motor skill test. So your job on this pegboard test is not the most exciting, but you see those little cups of pegs that are at the top, and you're supposed to take one at a time and put one at a time into the little holes in the pegboard as quickly as you can. Your speed is going to be impacted by whether you drop any of them or you are not accurately placing it into the hole or other kinds of things. And so it's a psychomotor control test. Psychomotor tests account for about 16 to 28% of the variance on job performance, is particularly in jobs that require fine motor skills or reaction time. So, of course, this is not going to be an appropriate test for a lot of different kinds of jobs. So not suitable for all jobs. All right, what about personality tests? Oh, this has become very popular in organizations lately to administer personality tests and then draw big inferences about a person's likelihood of success on the job as a function of their performance. Now, just to define personality, it's an individual's traits or predispositions to behave in a particular way across situations. So when we define personality as consistency, really, right, that you are consistently reacting regardless of where you are, but given the same prompt, you would behave the same way. We can imagine that we could generate questions that ask, have you ever done this? How do you typically respond in this situation? And like that. And then we could generalize it to, you probably would act like that at work as well. So about 40% of Fortune 500 companies use personality tests to one degree or another. If you were to apply to Home Depot or Les Schwab, just to name a couple of local kinds of, well, Home Depot's national, but Les Schwab a little bit more local, both of them have personality tests as part of just their screening procedure. Typically, they're going to be self-report personality tests. The non-self-report tests are very uncommon in psychology at all. So certainly not very common when you're doing personality testing in the workplace. The NEO is a measure of neuroticism, extroversion, and openness. So it's like 3 out of the big 5 factors are being measured by the NEO. The Hogan inventories measure extroversion and neuroticism. They always have those components, and then some other things that aren't necessarily on the big 5. The 16 personality factor questionnaire is really popular among organizations lately, and it takes the assumption that there are 16 basic personality factors. So if Big 5 thinks there's 5, if NEO thinks there's 3, the 16 PF thinks there's 16 different personality factors. The Big 5 has to be the most popular of all the trait personality tests, and including in the workplace. And I spelled it out OCEAN by organizing the traits in this order, so you could have a little mnemonic device to remember it. You actually could also spell canoe if you feel like it. If you don't want to be influenced by my ocean organization, you can use canoe. Can't get away from a water theme, but you can use those as sort of mnemonic devices for remembering the 5 traits. And the idea with personality tests is that people have consistencies in their behavior. It may not be perfect from one situation to the next, but it is consistent, and that people vary on how they respond to the exact same stimulus. If you don't think people vary, then why would we bother measuring this, right? And so the assumption is people vary, and that people are consistent across time and space. Personality tests account for about 23% of the variance in the criterion. Conscientiousness and neuroticism are the best predictors. We've talked about conscientiousness before, sort of being, a tendency towards being on time, a tendency towards doing, feeling like I should do a good job, attention to detail, consistency. These are all parts of conscientiousness. Neuroticism gets at a tendency towards being worrisome, a tendency towards depression or anxiety. And so a higher level of conscientiousness is typically associated with better performance on the job, and a lower level of neuroticism tends to be associated with better performance on the job. Again, this is one of those things that they've tested lots of different cultures, and the consistency is there, where pretty much these two personality characteristics are good predictors of performance no matter where it's been measured. Now, one of the main problems with personality tests is that people sometimes will fake their answers on a personality test, trying to present themselves as what they believe the organization wants. So I'm going to give you a small, not that big of faking, but example. My husband's friend was the manager of a Les Schwab and wanted my husband to come in and help during a really busy time and not work there all the time, but you had to go through the hiring process. And so the first step in the hiring process was to complete a personality scale online. And it was clearly a personality scale that was emphasizing conscientiousness and really, I think, agreeableness. I think they wanted people who were high in agreeableness. That's a person who is willing to, if you're high in agreeableness, you are a person who is a lot more willing to smooth over another person. Sort of the negative aspects of being high in agreeableness is that it's easier to sort of trick you, take advantage of you. That's some of the negative stuff that can come from being so accommodating in, having a really high level of agreeableness. Well, as he was taking the scale, he saw these questions that were things like, you've got a disgruntled customer. What they're saying is not right, and it's not company policy. They want their money back for something that they've used that isn't, you're supposed to give them credit or something. What are you going to do? And my husband was taking the perspective that, well, I'm here to enforce the company policy. So he was giving answers about that. But apparently the correct answers were, well, whatever it would take to make the customer satisfied, higher agreeableness than he was expressing. I only know what they were looking for because the manager said, well, you came out looking very disagreeable. And my husband goes, well, I was trying to back up the organization. And the manager was saying, well, what they want is people who are yes, yes, I'll give free tires. Yes, I will give a free brake change, whatever it takes, right? And so in a certain way, my husband was kind of faking in the way that he wasn't answering necessarily the way he naturally would always behave. He was answering in a way that he thought was representative of what an organization would want to hear, right? Turned out it didn't work to his favor because he was not interpreting what they wanted correctly. But it's kind of a problem, right? That people will give answers that are consistent with what they think you would want to hear. They think about 1/3 of applicants probably fake at least some of their answers and try and make themselves seem less neurotic or make themselves seem more conscientious or whatever. Fakers who do that are more likely to engage in non-productive behaviors. I have to say that had they hired my husband, they wouldn't have seen non-productive behaviors, even though he did attempt to fake on the answers. So obviously it's not always the case that a faker would then do what we call non-productive behaviors, foreshadowing stuff that'll come up in class later. Non-productive behaviors include things like wasting time at work or coming in late or leaving early. It also could be things like taking supplies from the employer. It also could include things like damaging the organization's property and things like that. So, we go from a sort of wasting time all the way up to actually harming the bottom line for the organization. Just for fun, I thought I'd show you these correlations between Big Five traits and college student behaviors. You'll notice there's a lot of blank space. That means there is no correlation between certain behaviors that college students may or may not engage in, and then these personality traits. But I thought, I thought I highlighted them. But what you will notice is that neuroticism, so being higher in neuroticism, means that you're more worrisome, more prone to depression or anxiety. And so it's not surprising that higher neuroticism is associated with a higher likelihood of having been in therapy or counseling. Lower neuroticism is associated with having marched or protested against an injustice. With extroversion, that being lower in extroversion, so not as outgoing, is associated with being addicted to the internet and having read 12 or more books in 1 year. Being higher on extroversion, so more outgoing, is more likely to have had a spring break in Florida or Mexico, having fallen in love at first sight, and having thrown a party for 20 or more people. Makes sense, right? And so we see everything that openness correlates with is positively correlated. We've got one correlation with agreeableness, and it's negative. So people who are less agreeable are more likely to have had a lover whose name you have forgotten. Everything that correlates with conscientiousness was negatively correlated for the college students. So people who are less conscientious were more likely to have gone on spring break, more likely to have gotten drunk for the sake of getting drunk, and more likely to have pulled an all-nighter to complete an assignment. So we can kind of see some work-like behaviors being displayed with these questions for college students, and then how some of these traits correlate. You don't see much going on with agreeableness. You see a lot of stuff going on with extroversion and openness, and conscientiousness next, and then neuroticism next after that. So if it were up to me, if I were to be administering a Big Five inventory, I'd probably focus most heavily on openness and extroversion if it were me. Anyway, at least for college students. I don't know about for employees. Anyway, here is a nice little chart, and if you want to pause this video and think about the question that I posed, you're welcome to do it. There is no right answer. It's just a thought question. So I will stop talking. You can stare at this if you want, and then I will see you in the next video.